Hey everybody, this is Dr. Johnny, and today I'm really excited to be talking to actually really one of the people I most admire in the entire field, David Perlmutter. Now, if you don't know David Perlmutter, which I think is very unlikely for this audience, but he is a board-certified neurologist. He's a fellow of the American College of Nutrition. He's an associate professor at the University of Miami Medical School. And a lot of people think somebody like David just sort of springs from the head of Zeus. You know, I live in LA, a lot of actors, they have a big movie and you say, oh, where did he come from? He's an overnight success. I've been reading and studying David's work. I'm going to embarrass you for a second here. Can you see if this camera gets this book? Wow. This book, how old is this? 15 years ago? And you look 20 years old. You look like you're 20. So David has actually been, you know, in the forefront of functional and integrative medicine at the cutting edge of this stuff for so long. And I've heard so many presentations of yours, and they're just so impressive. And with all these interviews, we didn't do any preparation. There's no questions sent. His publicist didn't send me a list of questions. I've just got what I think is what people would want to ask you if they were lucky enough to have a half an hour with you. So I'm just going to jump in.
The lightning round. Here we go.
The lightning round, exactly. Now, because this is a summit about metabolism and fat loss, I'm going to try to bring some of this stuff back to that. But of course, your specialty has been and always has been the brain. So let me just start by asking, what is the connection between the brain and the belly? Where does it come in? How does the brain actually impact the ability to lose weight, the ability to lose fat, and metabolism in general? What's the connection?
Well, let me just take a step back before we talk about the brain's ability to help us with metabolism and help us lose weight, and recognize that, again, as you mentioned, I'm a neurologist, and my mission in life is not to try to cure neurologic disease, but really my mission is to keep them from happening in the first place. And that's how I circle back to your question, because we see a direct relationship between the size of the belly measured in terms of waist to hip ratio, and also correlated to body mass index, I might add, to the degree of shrinkage of the brain's memory center. This was published in the journal Neurology, put out by the American Academy of Neurology, so that the bigger the belly, the smaller is your hippocampus. And clearly, the size matters when it comes to your hippocampus. People argue about other parts of the body saying size doesn't matter, but when it comes to your hippocampus, there's a perfect correlation between memory function and size of the hippocampus. So we know that this is an important correlation. Then the bigger your belly, the more shrinkage of your hippocampus you have. So in terms of this relationship being relevant and being important for me as a preventive individual, preventive neurologist, it really is fundamental. So we then have to ask ourselves, well, what are the key players here in terms of making that belly big in the first place? Why do we store fat in the belly, visceral fat? And I am certain that you are covering with other people you're interviewing the primal role of visceral fat in terms of enhancing inflammation. But, you know, the real issue that we're focused on these days is the relationship between the changes in the gut bacteria, the human microbiome, and risk for putting on those pounds in the belly, then down the line, for me, risk for dementia, shrinkage of the hippocampus. So I think that makes a powerful connection then between brain health and disease, degeneration in general, and the gut bacteria. I mean, that seems like a very big stretch, relating the gut and goings-on in the gut to risk for brain disease, but it's through the intermediate step of a bigger belly. And we now clearly recognize that changes in the gut bacteria have a huge role to play in enhancing an individual's risk for not only making fat, but storing fat and locking that fat up and making it unavailable for being burned or being used as a caloric source. And incredibly, these issues relate to some really popular dietary choices that people are making today, not the least of which is our incredible usage of artificial sweeteners, which incredibly change the microbiome to such a degree as to pave the way for not only obesity and type 2 diabetes as well. So, I just want to emphasize what I just said. The very foods that people are eating in hopes of losing weight and getting rid of that big belly, the artificially sweetened foods and beverages, are actually dramatically associated with increased risk for obesity, as well as a dramatic increased risk for becoming a type 2 diabetic. Why does it matter to me and why does it matter to the viewers of this interview? It matters a whole heck of a lot, because if you become a type 2 diabetic, you have quadrupled your risk for Alzheimer's disease, and currently that is a disease for which we have no treatment. So, I guess this is the short answer to your question, why in the heck am I interested in body fat? I'm interested in body fat because it is not only a marker of inflammation, but it is actually as well an instigator of inflammation. It's not just a neutral, innocent bystander storage of calorie depot. It is actually a very active organ in the body and dramatically involved in the production of what are called inflammatory cytokines that then go on to prove damaging to the brain. When we recognize that things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, autism, depression are fundamentally inflammatory issues, then the notion that body fat related to inflammation in terms of playing a role in my specialty, neurology, really gets a lot of substantiation.
You mentioned Alzheimer's, which will take me down about 10 different rabbit holes, but one of them is this. We're hearing Alzheimer's called type 3 diabetes a lot, which I think is a recognition of maybe some similar causes, some similar relationships with blood sugar and insulin. Could you address a little bit about that? I think a lot of people who have struggled with weight and fat loss are familiar with insulin and its role as a fat-making hormone, and the role of blood sugar in keeping that under control because it drives insulin up. But I think this notion that Alzheimer's is a kind of type 3 diabetes is not yet broken through to the public, and it might be a great way to address this relationship between body fat, blood sugar, insulin, and the brain and fat loss. Could you talk about that for just a minute?
Well, absolutely. So brain health is intimately related to sugar, glucose, and insulin activity. A study published in September 2013 in the New England Journal of Medicine actually followed a group of about 6,000 individuals over a period of up to 7 years, and found that those individuals at the beginning of the study who had even slight elevation of their blood sugar had a significantly increased risk for becoming demented. And these are levels of blood sugar that are nowhere near what we would define as pre-diabetic or even certainly diabetic. These are levels of like 105 and 110, where typically a doctor gives you a pat on the back and say, hey, don't worry about it. Maybe you should exercise more and drink some diet sodas instead of sugar-sweetened sodas. I almost make fun, but in reality, that's what happens. But what this really powerful study in the New England Journal demonstrated to us was that even subtle elevations of blood sugar were associated with an incurable disease, and that is Alzheimer's disease. So I think first we need to redefine not what is normal in terms of blood sugar, but what is optimal, and recognize that the brain is absolutely a target organ of even subtle elevations of blood sugar, perhaps being more involved with negative reactions to blood sugar than any other part of the body. I mean, diabetics are at risk for kidney disease, for example, eye issues, because their blood sugars are so high. But now we're seeing evidence published again in the New England Journal of Medicine, clearly pointing the finger at even subtle elevations as being profoundly detrimental to the brain. Indeed, Alzheimer's has been called type 3 diabetes because of the relationship of brain metabolism to sugar, to insulin, insulin resistance, I think more importantly, insulin like a growth factor as well. And I think that it's a very intriguing term because, the more it gets out there, you're right, it's not really well known in the public arena, but the more people can make that connection between diabetes 1, 2, or 3, however you want to call it, and the brain, the more they're going to relate sugar and dietary issues to the brain, as they should. Because, we have been bamboozled over the past 30 years into thinking that somehow dietary fat was our enemy to some degree, and that when that all happened and we began eating low-fat and no-fat foods, then by default we bumped up our consumption of sugars and carbohydrates to fill in the blanks in terms of caloric availability. And that has been our undoing. If you don't believe it, just walk around in a public place, a shopping mall or an airport.
Disneyland.
Get a good sense as to what the cross-section of Western cultures looks like, and it's very, very distressing. So that said, this is the relationship then between, again, getting back to body fat, which is stored in the presence of elevated insulin. Gary Taubes has done such a wonderful job in terms of raising the public awareness about the role of insulin, not just to pack away blood sugar when your blood sugar is elevated, but also perhaps more from an evolutionary perspective, that secretion of insulin has allowed us to survive because it allows us to make and then store body fat. Traditionally, as hunter-gatherers, we would not eat sugar because it wasn't available except for a very brief window in the year, in the late summer, early fall, when the fruit, the blueberries, if you will, would ripen, and we, with our natural sweet tooth that we all have, would gravitate to eating things like blueberries and other berries because they were sweet. And that would stimulate, because of their glucose content, our bodies to make insulin. And what did insulin do? It caused us to store fat. We made it through the winter, and we're here today having this conversation. But the problem is that that mechanism is in operation in individuals today who are eating sugars 365 days a year, and that mechanism for fat storage is operant for the winter that never comes. So we're packing calories away for no good reason in the form of fat, and then again recognizing that this body fat dramatically enhances this whole inflammatory cascade, which is bad for the brain, bad for the heart, bad for the immune system, and certainly bad in terms of leading to diabetes with its issues as it relates to the brain. The bottom line is we've got to reconnect with the science that lets us understand that you can power the brain with fat. As a matter of fact, you can power the brain extremely efficiently with fat, creating more ATP molecules and creating far less damaging free radicals as compared to when the brain is burning carbs. This notion that the brain needs sugar, therefore you have to eat the carbs each day is beyond utter nonsense. Does the brain burn glucose? It does. But to say that the brain has a preferred fuel is a little bit of beyond anthropomorphism. It's biochemically inappropriate. Well, if the brain should prefer a fuel because it's the best fuel in terms of efficiency and protection and longevity, then it would be burning fat.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up, because it was really going to segue right into what I wanted to talk about next, which is the dietary recommendations of the past 40 years, which we've talked about and which I wrote about in The Great Cholesterol Myth, are really based on a horrendous fear of fat, specifically saturated fat, largely because we believe saturated fat raises cholesterol, and cholesterol causes heart disease. And of course, if that hypothesis is not true, the dietary recommendations crumble like a house of cards. You have done so much to kind of help rehabilitate the reputation of fat, including saturated fat. So I want to ask you, you mentioned in the latest book about a 2013 study showing that elderly people who added more fat to their diet actually had better cognitive function, more resistance to cognitive impairment and dementia and Alzheimer's. Can you talk about, and this is directly related, I think, to dietary choices for weight loss, because so many people have been on low-fat diets in a misguided attempt to lose weight, and laboring under the misconception that eating fat actually makes you fat. So let me ask you this outright. Is saturated fat bad for us?
No.
Good. I'm so glad to hear. When you wrote that in Grain Brain, I did a little, cheerleader yippee-yay with the little click up my heels, because as a nutritionist, taking a kind of a contrarian stance for all these years, the most we've been able to kind of say is, maybe it's not as bad. Maybe it's a little neutral. And you actually came out and said, screw this pussyfooting around. Saturated fat is good for you. It's good for the brain. We've been completely misled about it. So I would love it if you could talk a little bit about that notion, because I think it affects people who are trying to lose weight just as much as it affects people who are trying to protect their brain.
Well, I'd be delighted to. And, one of the things about writing books is when the validating studies come out after the book has been published, you say, gee, I wish I would have had that study to go into either, in my case, Grain Brain or Brain Maker, my newer book. But that said, in February of this year, there was published a report in the Annals of Internal Medicine that was a meta-analysis of over 500,000 individuals and looked at things like risk for coronary artery events in relationship to dietary questionnaires related to saturated fat, and there was no relationship whatsoever, meaning those individuals eating the highest level of saturated fat, a type of fat that humans have eaten for arguably a couple of million years until somebody said, no, you shouldn't because something terrible will happen. Suddenly we're going back now to eating a food that we've always eaten. But with relevance to saturated fat in the brain, we understand that saturated fat is important as a component of cell membranes and including neurons, as is cholesterol, I might add. And the unique and wonderful thing about saturated fat is it is highly resistant to the process of being oxidized or damaged by free radicals. So that's the beauty of something that is saturated. We use a type of intervention in dealing with various neurologic conditions by giving some very exotic type of fat that you can hardly get anywhere that's highly saturated. It goes by the name of coconut oil. So we use a lot of coconut oil, 90% saturated, as a way of actually allowing the brain to move away from the burning of carbohydrates as a fuel and shift over to a process called ketosis, of actually burning fats, certain fats that are in fact metabolized from consuming coconut oil. There is actually an FDA-approved medical food that you can write a prescription for patients with Alzheimer's disease that in fact has shown some effect in terms of memory improvement. Again, we know that if we can improve the energetics of the brain, we can safeguard the brain and we can improve function. And that's exactly what you're doing when the brain is burning these ketones. When we give things like coconut oil to patients and we restrict their carbohydrates, they shift over to a metabolism where they're burning ketones, and it's very, very therapeutic. So the whole notion of saturated fats is it's really been appended gratefully, based upon science, gratefully. When you recognize that 50% of the fat in human breast milk is saturated fat, that should even give you pause. I mean, you're going to tell us that you shouldn't have saturated fat, but babies shouldn't drink breast milk. Those things are inconsistent. The saturated fat in breast milk is important because it helps to build a stronger, more resilient, more functional brain. That's why it's there. This has been, trial and error for millions of years, and it works out that way. So gratefully, a lot of these long-held notions are being appended. It's not comfortable for most people because, people become wedded in the notion that fats are bad, that dietary cholesterol is somehow going to cause problems, and that saturated fat is harmful, and that we should be eating lots and lots of carbohydrates in the form of whole grains. We're seeing that these things get turned over, and actually it's a real issue of coming full circle, because we're really getting back to what we've always eaten. And we just got off the road here for a short period of time. For 50 years or so, we've really, maybe more, maybe longer if you look at sugar, early 1800s, we've really just gotten off the right path. We're getting back on the right path. And I think I'd like to mention that now as we move forward, I believe that we're going to be looking at our food choices in terms of the macronutrients of fat, carbohydrates, and protein, and the micronutrients, including fiber, not just from their direct physiologic activities in terms of how we utilize these foods ourselves, but I think more importantly, as we start to look at our food choices through the lens of the microbiome, through the lens of the 100 trillion bacteria that live within us, in terms of how our food influences the array, the complexity, and the diversity of these organisms and their effects upon our health and metabolism, we will look upon food in an entirely different, new, and exciting way. This is really where diet becomes hugely empowering in terms of allowing us to regain our health.
Well, before we go into some of the things you talk about in BrainMaker, I have some specific questions about that with the microbiome. I want to, before we leave ketones, ketogenic diets, so much misinformation about this. For years, doctors confused nutritional ketosis with diabetic ketoacidosis. They thought, it was a life-threatening condition. You tell your average medical doctor about being on the Atkins diet, and they would practically go apoplectic because they were sure that this would be just a terrible, terrible thing. We do know, we have a couple of speakers on this program who are big advocates of ketogenic diets. I've heard rumors that you try to stay ketogenic most of the time.
I do, and that is for several reasons.
Please.
I think that it's really pretty well substantiated that being in mild ketosis is probably the normal, natural, steady state for humans.
Mm-hmm. And what does it take to do that?
It takes a modicum of effort to restrict your carbohydrates. I'm not saying to not eat carbohydrate-laden vegetables and a little bit of fruit. Mm-hmm. But pounding your body with 2 glasses of orange juice in the morning that's giving you 60, 70 grams of carbohydrates, 18 teaspoons of sugar before you had your croissant, bagel, and cereal makes no sense. Humans have never experienced the carbohydrate load that we're experiencing today. And I do take added fat to my diet, added olive oil, coconut oil, nuts and seeds, etc., fish oils as well, and keep myself in a slight state of ketosis. Mm-hmm. When we look at the effect of ketosis on gene expression, on basic metabolism, on looking at how, for example, malignant cells metabolize and by and large requiring glucose and not able to facilitate the use of ketones, it seems to me to be really the right choice. And frankly, I have a first-degree relative, or I had until my dad died a couple of months ago, with Alzheimer's. So I need to do everything I can. In addition to a ketogenic diet, daily aerobic exercise is key for amplifying the gene expression for a growth hormone, if you will, called BDNF, that actually stimulates the growth of the hippocampus. So from a personal and a professional perspective, this is the ticket. And there are plenty of sticks in the mud who don't want to change and are resistant. But I always think back of the quote on the office of a friend of mine, Dr. Amar Bose. You're probably wearing his headphones right now. And on the glass door of his office, it read a quote from Maurice Maeterlinck, from a Belgian Nobel laureate. At every crossway on the road that leads to the future, each progressive spirit is opposed by 1,000 men appointed to defend the past. So, it's easy to defend the past because it's a comfortable place to live. And it's not as comfortable to push the ball down the field and to adopt new issues and adapt to change. But I believe clearly that's the mission. Otherwise, we will stagnate and accept the status quo. Ronald Reagan said that status quo is a Latin term for the mess we are in. And if you don't believe it, again, visit the shopping mall and you'll see the mess that we are in. Just as a kind of a global perspective, the World Health Organization has indicated a couple of interesting things. First, that non-communicable diseases are now the #1 health issue in the world. Even in developing countries, it is not infectious disease anymore. It's chronic, progressive, degenerative issues. The coronary artery disease, diabetes, cancer issues as well, but most of the degenerative conditions, Alzheimer's in my field, and diabetes, of course, globally. And they have talked about a goal called 25-25, meaning by 2025 they want to reduce these issues by 25%. Very ambitious. The way to do that is to change what's happening right now. When the United States Governmental Dietary Advisory Committee that published their 700-page compendium earlier this year tells us that the biggest issue in terms of threatening our health isn't dietary fat, it's the sugar and the carbs, it really offers up a heck of a lot of validation for all of us who've been saying this for the past couple of decades. You know, for you and Dr. Sinatra, who have come out and talked about, about cholesterol not being the issue here. Cholesterol is vital for life. My goodness, all the sex hormones, cortisol, vitamin D are manufactured from cholesterol. It's a brain antioxidant. It's a fundamental player in cell membranes throughout the body. So it is time that we really take a deep breath and recognize that what, in general, the public is being spoon-fed, quite literally, is not in their best interest.
Well put, well put. In Brainmaker, you actually talked about two classes of bacteria in the microbiome, which I probably can't pronounce because I was not familiar with them. Please, Firmicutes, and I'm not even going to try the other one. But I found it fascinating in Brainmaker when you explained how some of these actually extract energy from food more efficiently than others. Some are statistically significantly more associated with the gut microbiome of obese people as opposed to lean people. Could you just talk to us a little bit about those two classes of bacteria and how our dietary choices might affect them?
Well, I would first indicate that it's not a question of might affect. Our dietary choices have a very dramatic effect on the regulation of the various populations of organisms that live within us, as well as the diversity and as well the ratio of these two very large classes of organisms, the Firmicutes and the Bacteroidetes, making up 70 to 80% of the bacteria that live within us. And I'll take you back to a study published 3 years ago that analyzed the fecal contents in terms of bacteria of children living in sub-Saharan Africa in a country called Burkina Faso and compared those findings to children living in Western Europe. And the findings are really quite dramatic in terms of the differences, not just in the ratios of these two large groups of organisms, the Firmicutes and the Bacteroidetes, with the African children in a very rural area having much lower levels of Firmicutes and higher levels of Bacteroidetes. But even beyond that, the products of the gut bacteria, and specifically what they looked at, are what are called the short-chain fatty acids. These are products of carbohydrate metabolism in the colon. Short-chain fatty acids are important as a fuel for the cells lining the colon. At least butyrate is certainly one important short-chain fatty acid. But we now understand that these short-chain fatty acids also act to modify the expression of our own genome. What does that mean? It means that the gut bacteria, through these short-chain fatty acids, are able to control our human genetic destiny. That really puts a spin on our understanding of the microbiome and also what we do to control our microbiome, how we nurture it or not. So, since that study was done, there's been more and more literature that confirms the notion that higher levels of Firmicutes seems to be associated with higher risk for becoming obese. Dr. Jeffrey Gordon has done research in which he has actually inoculated laboratory animals that were germ-free with the gut bacteria of obese humans that have higher levels of Firmicutes, and lo and behold, even though these laboratory animals are fed the same chow as their neighbors, they get fat. And what does it mean? It means even though they're getting the same chow, same calorie count, etc., very strictly controlled, these organisms that live within these laboratory animals extract more calories and do other things that tend to increase the risk for obesity. And that also has to do with its effect upon glucose response and insulin sensitivity. So it's becoming very clear now that being overweight and obese has more to do with other things that we haven't recognized before. Yes, it's diet, But when patients tell me, you know, doctor, I promise you, I am on the strictest diet you can imagine. I'm on 1,200 calories a day. I'm at the gym. I'm on the treadmill, and I cannot lose weight. We now have to consider that they may indeed have a gut bacterial array that is it's just standing in their way. They can't lose weight because this gut bacteria is changing their insulin sensitivity rate. And when insulin becomes, the body becomes less sensitive to insulin, more insulin is secreted. And the more insulin that's secreted, as I mentioned earlier, the more fat you develop. And in addition, higher levels of Firmicutes may be extracting more calories from the very food that they eat, even their 1,200 calories. And again, one of the biggest issues that we see is this use of artificial sweeteners that has a dramatic effect upon the microbiome, and it is associated with significant increased risk for obesity and type 2 diabetes. That was an elegant study published in the journal Nature by Israeli researchers who actually looked at 3 artificial sweeteners that are commonly used in humans: saccharin, aspartame, and sucralose. And they found that the changes that were imparted on the microbiome of the laboratory animals from these 3 artificial sweeteners were dramatic. It turns out that saccharin was the worst offender. And so then in the rest of their research, they used saccharin to see what else they could learn about it. They found that when they induced the changes in the laboratory animals by giving them saccharin, changed their microbiomes, then they took the fecal material from the fat laboratory animals and transplanted that into a germ-free animal. That animal got fat as well. So we see that it wasn't the direct effect of the artificial sweeteners, but it was an effect upon the microbiome. They took the artificial sweeteners out of the equation and found that the microbiome, when transplanted, did the same thing. And then they did something even more remarkable. They chose human subjects, and they gave a group of 7 humans the maximum FDA-approved daily amount of saccharin for only 1 week. And in 4 of those 7 individuals, their tests of insulin sensitivity, glucose responsiveness, etc., were dramatically changed within 1 week of changing their microbiome. How did they know it was their microbiome? They did exactly the same thing. They took the fecal material from these, what are called responders, they transplanted it into a laboratory rodent, and lo and behold, immediately these animals became insulin resistant and blood sugars went up. So it really is very humbling to recognize a couple of things. First, that we are very dependent upon the health of our microbiome in every way, and that we didn't recognize this over the years. 90% of the information published about the microbiome in peer-reviewed journals has only come out in the past 5 years. And, you know, we want to think that we're the center of the universe, and it turns out that we're not. That our gut bacteria outnumber the cells of our bodies by a factor of 10 to 1, and their DNA outnumbers our DNA by a factor of 100 to 1, meaning that you are 99% bacterial DNA compared to this wonderful 23,000 gene genome that we inherited from mom and dad.
Now, here's what I don't want people listening to this to feel. That they're stuck with a certain microbiome, maybe they have more Firmicutes than they need to have, and, you know, is this just their fate? What can people do if, in fact, they have a gut flora, a population of their internal garden, if you will, that favors extracting every last calorie from what they eat and putting on fat and making their bodies less sensitive to insulin? What I know none of this would matter if we didn't have a program to give them to try to correct that. And you actually say in Brainmaker, you tell a very touching story of your father, who you just mentioned, and you ask, you know, what could we do to prevent this? And I have a feeling that the diet that we would use to prevent that, or at least reduce the risk for that, is very similar to the diet that we'd use to prevent diabetes and to prevent obesity, and maybe to correct the microbiome problems that may exist for obese people. So what would be the program? What would you advise somebody coming to you saying, you know, I think I'm stuck with this imbalance in my gut and everything, like you said, 1,200 calories a day, I'm on the treadmill 9 hours a day, nothing is working. What would be the top 3 things you tell them to do?
First, you know, I'd say that who is this for? I mean, I think you asked that in that question. It's really for everyone. The notion that there is a brain healthy diet, and then there's a heart healthy diet, and then there's a diet to help you lose and maintain body weight.
An anti-yeast diet.
Still,
Right.
When people say, oh, your diet is similar to what a cardiologist is Dr. Masley is talking about for the heart, what Dr. Hyman is talking about with respect to blood sugar. The point is there's not one healthy diet for the heart at the cost of being bad for the pancreas or the brain. It doesn't work that way. Obviously, if we have survived 2 million years based upon food availability, our physiology has been honed to respond to certain food cues. But not just our physiology, but our microbiome as well. We have co-evolved along with this gut bacteria. And if I can digress for just one moment, we now have the ability to determine what was the microbiome from our ancestors. New technology has looked at fossilized fecal material and also even able to look at the calculus between the teeth in fossilized specimen and determine what was the microbiome of our ancestors thousands and thousands of years ago. And interestingly, as an aside, what was found is really that the microbiome is very similar to what I described earlier, or the microbiome of those individuals living today in very rural populations. So I would say my sense is that would be an ideal microbiome. We really don't know yet what that means. But I think before we get to the part about what you can do to rehab your gut bacteria, let's just for one brief moment talk about those factors that have led you astray, that have compromised your gut bacteria, and that includes your moment of birth. And it turns out that a very important thing happens at the moment of birth when you pass through the birth canal. At that moment, a baby is coated with bacteria that live in and around the birth canal, and those bacteria set up shop in that infant's intestine. They're in his mouth or her mouth, nose, and etc., all over the skin, and that forms the basis for his or her microbiome, and to some degree, that is the set point that has to adapt that individual to his or her environment for the rest of his or her life.
Oh, boy.
Think about that. Now, the reason I bring it up is because right now in America, 1/3 of children are born by cesarean section. And their microbiome is formed by whatever's floating around in the operating room, whatever is on the surgeon's gown, and whatever might be on mother's skin. And it's really not a highly functional microbiome. When we see that risk of children born by C-section developing autism is increased as much as being doubled, triple the risk of ADHD, significant increased risk, 70% of type 1 diabetes, 50% increased risk of becoming obese as an adult in comparison to kids born naturally, we have to understand that that's a very pivotal point in the development of the microbiome, and really pivotal in terms of the set point of immunity, of inflammation, and metabolism for the rest of that person's life. Wow. So, but beyond that, we then look at what are some of the traumas to the established microbiome that we need to be aware of. So right now, before we get to the rehab part, we're in the preventive part.
Okay.
I think on the top of that list would probably be our incredible overusage of antibiotics. Antibiotics are really weapons of mass destruction when it comes to the microbiome, weapons of mass microbial destruction. So, when we feel like we've got to load kids up with antibiotics every time they pull on their ear or cough or complain of a sore throat, we need to reassess that. Same thing with adults. Patients are forever wanting me to call something in because they have a cold. And it really doesn't make any sense. So that said, when the World Health Organization lists antibiotic overusage as one of the top 2 health issues facing the world, top 3 facing the world today, we have to pay attention to that. And it's not just from the perspective of creating antibiotic-resistant superbugs, it is also from the perspective of what it's doing to the microbiome. Mm-hmm. So our overusage of antibiotics is really critically important. Third part is food. It's really quite clear that the American diet that is so devoid of fiber, not to mention prebiotic fiber, as well as high in sugar, artificial sweeteners, artificial ingredients, food that has residues of herbicides like glyphosate the active ingredient in Roundup, all threaten the microbiome and pave the way for issues that we now relate to the microbiome. Front and center are the degenerative conditions that are inflammation and or immunity based. That's what the microbiome does. So when we change these gut bacteria, we lead to a situation where the gut becomes permeable and a chemical called LPS from the gut gets into the systemic circulation and amps up inflammation. That's a bad thing. When, again, we look at inflammation as being a pivotal player in diabetes, cancer, inflammation, Alzheimer's, coronary artery disease. We've got to look at the beginning of this flow sheet, not the very end of the flow sheet, not trying to develop chemicals to treat inflammation in the joint in an arthritic patient, but ask ourselves, wait a minute, where did the inflammation come from in the first place? Let's focus on the fire, not just the smoke. So what we've got to then do to rehab the gut would be my first recommendation is start eating a lot of nutrient-dense, fiber-rich, colorful vegetables that are organic. I think on your plate, what I'd like to see is mostly colorful, rich, above-ground vegetables. I think that foods that are fermented are really nifty because they're loaded with gut restorative good bacteria. These are things like kimchi, which is a Korean spicy fermented cabbage dish, sauerkraut, cultured yogurt, kefir. These are, as a beverage as well, kombucha. These are foods that are fermented. And frankly, humans have eaten foods that are fermented for probably as long as we've been hunter-gatherers. Fermented is a nice way of saying food that is rotting. I mean, when a food is on the ground and it ends up rotting, it's covered with organisms that are gobbling up the food and fermenting and replicating, and we always ate that. We didn't have the luxury of going to the grocery store. We ate what we could find or what we could kill. The other really fundamental pillar here is to welcome to the table foods that are rich in a special type of fiber called prebiotic fiber. And the prebiotic fiber foods will enrich the growth of the bacteria that live within you, the good bacteria, help you make the right kind of, for example, short-chain fatty acids. So these are foods like Mexican yam or jicama, dandelion greens, garlic, onions, leeks, Jerusalem artichoke. Or you can buy prebiotic fiber, go to the health food store. They sell various brands of commercially available prebiotic fiber. Things like acacia gum is one of my favorites. You can go and buy a supplement of acacia gum, get a good probiotic supplement at the health food store, and you're opening the door to recolonizing your gut with good gut bacteria, and at the same time, you're amplifying the growth of those bacteria as well as the growth of the good organisms that already reside within you.
Now, as long as we're talking about things that not only upset the microbiome and predispose us to all the conditions we don't want to have, I'm going to just throw out a couple of things that you've talked about at great length in not only in Brain Maker, but in Grain Brain before that. I think I know what your reactions will be. I'm just going to throw them out and let you riff on them. Gluten.
I've heard of this gluten
You've
thing.
heard of this gluten thing, right? Well, I mention it because I think it's a good tie-in also between what you've written, what Bill Davis has written about what these things do to the brain, but also what they do to our waistline. So just give us a couple of minutes on gluten. I'm going to ask you about fructose, and then we can go back to the preventive program that will help not only our brains but our waistline at the same time.
Okay. Well,
and then I promise to let you go.
Oh, no, totally fine. Certainly, Dr. Davis has done an incredible job in talking about some of the components that are found in wheat, even well beyond gluten, that have roles to play in various pathways biochemically in the brain throughout the body. But I think that from my perspective, vis-a-vis the conversation we're having today, the gluten issue, and specifically part of gluten that's called gliadin, is an issue for this discussion because of its role in gut permeability that I was speaking about earlier. As Dr. Fasano at Harvard has clearly demonstrated, this gliadin protein found in gluten, causes the cells lining the colon to produce something called zonulin. And what zonulin does is it leads to a breakdown of the tight junctions that exist that give the gut integrity, that connect one cell to the next and allow the gut to be really fairly impermeable to certain issues. When you threaten that, then various things get out of the gut and into the bloodstream, like what I mentioned earlier, LPS or lipopolysaccharide. So it is really this understanding of gliadin found in gluten that makes me recoil when I see that 25% of the foods that are eaten in America today are based upon wheat, and therefore by and large contain gluten, as well as barley and rye, because of its role in terms of gut permeability. That becomes a cardinal issue in my world as it increases gut permeability, leading to LPS getting out into the systemic circulation, stimulating immunoreactive cells to produce through what are called toll-like receptors to produce these chemicals called cytokines, things like tumor necrosis factor alpha, that is specifically correlated to Alzheimer's disease. That's the connection, and that's where I come down on this issue with the argument, if you will, or let's call it a discussion with reference to the safety or not of gluten-containing foods. You know, that said, I think it's pretty well entrenched now that there is an entity called non-celiac gluten sensitivity, where people have physiologic responses that are maladaptive to gluten that are unrelated to an autoimmune condition that relates to a person's HLA typing that we call celiac disease. These are apples and oranges, if you will. Both are treated the same way, but they're very different. And I suspect that the individuals who do have non-celiac gluten sensitivity are a vast segment of our population, most of whom don't know this. I'd go so far as to say that everybody, based upon the mechanism that Dr. Fasano described, has some degree of reaction that is negative when they consume gluten-related foods.
Yeah, the thing that bothers me a lot, and I'm pretty sure you'd agree, is that so we have this epidemic of people eating gluten-free, but they're eating gluten-free junk foods, which still boost blood sugar and insulin, still contribute to fat storage, and probably still screw up the microbiome, but they don't have gluten in them. So
that's right.
You want to just demolish that one real quick for me?
I always talk about this in my presentations. I take people down the gluten-free aisle at a local health food store, and we look at the gluten-free cupcakes, one of which has 64 grams of carbohydrates in one cupcake. So you're already at your limit for the day.
Right.
So you don't get a free pass on the gluten-free aisle to eat whatever you want. I mean, that's where you find the gluten-free crackers, cookies, breads, pasta. And you've got to, again, gluten-free is important, but you've got to regulate your daily consumption of carbohydrate, or you will be busted and contribute to, again, issues related to your microbiome, challenging your insulin sensitivity on a daily basis, and really paving the way for being a standard American that we see today. That yesterday, here's an example. I was flying from Toronto to Fort Lauderdale, and I settled into my seat, reading the newspaper, and sure enough, the call goes out, is there a doctor on the plane? We have an emergency. This happened yesterday. So I turn around, and sure enough, there's a man unconscious in the aisle, and I get back to him, finally able to wake him up, ask him about his medical history. I mean, this man was very large, on a multitude of medications, had 2 myocardial infarctions, had a TIA, and was making, obviously, when we finally were able to, he just had a syncopal event, finally able to get him aroused, I started talking to him, really paying no attention to these issues, but relying on the status quo of current medicine by being a good boy, taking his cholesterol-lowering drugs and his blood pressure-lowering drugs and an aspirin each day in hopes that that will protect him. Well, again, those are issues that act, if they act at all, at the end of the line. Why are you hypertensive? Why do you have coronary artery disease narrowing? It's an inflammatory disorder. And here's a man who was clearly obese. These things are not disparate. You can't be healthy and obese. There is going to be a price to pay. When you are obese, you're fanning the flames of inflammation, and that's the cornerstone of all of these dreaded conditions. And I want to just tell you that At the end of the trip, it couldn't have been better. Here's the commercial. I'm waiting with my wife to get our bags, and a big man, smelling of cigarettes, comes up to me and says, "Hey, Doc, listen, if you needed nitroglycerin, I have it in my bag. I would have brought it if you needed it." And it was perfect. I mean, I'm thinking the only good that can come out of this is tomorrow Johnny's going to interview me and I'll tell this story. So there you go.
It's a good story. Let's go back to the program, because I know that we have to wrap up, but you've said tons of foods with probiotics like kimchi and kefir and all the naturally fermented foods, tons of brightly colored vegetables for their anti-inflammatory and their prebiotic and antioxidant power, all of that. In Brainmaker, you talk about going low carb and embracing high quality fat. You want to touch on that for just a moment, because I know that's something that really, for the people who are just like, how do I lose weight? And then the people who are like, how do I have a better brain and a better life? That's going to be a common thread right there. So how does that fit into the program of prevention?
Well, again, this seems very counterintuitive to most people. But what I'm saying, so there's no misunderstanding, is eat more fat. You will be healthier. It seems crazy. It does
slimmer, right? I mean,
I'm simply saying, eat more of the diet that humans have eaten for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years.
Yes.
Does that fall in line with the paleo recommendations? You bet it does. Mm-hmm. Fat is your friend. Now, let's be certainly very clear about that. Modified fats that have been treated in such a way to extend their shelf life are the devil's plaything. I mean, these are clearly going to represent coffin nails. Yeah. You got to avoid them like the plague. So I'm not talking about the vegetable oils that are on the grocery store shelves for 6 months or 12 months, and they're there a year later and they're still perfectly fine. They were never fine, and they're not going to be fine moving forward. I'm talking about fats that will go rancid if they age. That's what you want. It means they're still alive and they're dying. So, and this is the extra virgin olive oil that you should drink. A recent report came out called the MIND study, where they actually looked at the efficacy of the Mediterranean diet in terms of people consuming that diet and what was their risk for dementia. They found that was a good diet in terms of being associated with a reduced risk for dementia. But then they did something really very clever. They had 2 other groups that were on the Mediterranean diet, which is a very reasonable diet, the grains notwithstanding. But in these groups, they said, okay, be on the Mediterranean diet. In one group, we're going to ask you to eat nuts, a lot of nuts over the period of time. I believe it was 24 months. And the other group was to add olive oil, 1 liter a week to their regimen. That's a lot of fat. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that in terms of being associated with the most reduction of risk for dementia, it was the Mediterranean diet with the added olive oil. The highest fat diet, that's a lot of fat. And we now see that it helps people in terms of inflammatory markers, in terms of other biometrics, like lipid metabolism, glucose sensitivity, insulin sensitivity rather, glucose levels, hemoglobin A1C, body mass index. So it's been there all this time that we've needed to eat more fat at the cost of reducing our carbohydrate and simple sugar consumption.
Well, Dr. Perlmutter, I really so appreciate this time that you spent with us. It's just a compendium of information. I recommend, I've said many, many, many times, I think that Grain Brain and Brainmaker are 2 of the most important nutrition books of the last decade. I urge everybody listening to that to read both of those books and read them again, because there's just so much wonderful information in there. And I want to, again, thank you for spending so generously so much time with us today. I know people will be very helped by it, and thank you again.
Thank you, Johnny. That was really great. Your questions were so spot on, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.